Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. When I moved into the house, it was perfect, or so I thought. The kind of place you only dream about. A spacious, modern home with freshly painted walls, gleaming hardwood floors, and a view of the countryside that stretched for miles. I'd been looking for a place like this for years, and finally, after all the heartache and hassle of moving from one dingy apartment to the next, I had found it. It was the kind of house you think would make your life better, brighter, simpler. The first night, I settled in quickly, unpacking the essentials and arranging the furniture. It was just me. No partner, no roommates. Just me and the silence of a home that should have been filled with warmth, but instead felt eerily cold. It didn't feel like a home, not yet. Maybe that's why I was so determined to make it mine. I was alone when I climbed into bed that night. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the wind rustling through the trees outside the window. It was perfect, but there was something else too. A stillness, a heaviness in the air that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was the stress of the move, the unfamiliarity of the place. I closed my eyes, telling myself I'd adjust in time. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like the house was creaking. It wasn't uncommon for new homes to settle, but this was different. It wasn't the floorboards cracking or a door shifting. It was a tapping, almost rhythmic, like something tapping against the wall, just beyond my reach. I brushed it off at first. Houses make noises. I was used to that, but as the minutes passed, the tapping grew louder, closer, and then it started to change, like something was scraping, dragging against the wall. Faint, but unmistakable. My heart began to race. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a house settling. The sound came from inside the wall, and it wasn't stopping. I got out of bed, my legs weak beneath me as I stood in the dim light of the bedroom. My phone was on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, feeling a sudden urgency. I'd heard of these kinds of things before, the odd noises that people dismiss as nothing, only to realize too late that something is very much wrong. I didn't want to tell anyone yet. No, I didn't want to look crazy, but I had to know. I walked cautiously toward the master bedroom wall where the tapping was coming from. My phone's flashlight cut through the dark like a small beacon. The tapping had stopped, but now there was something else, a soft scratching. It was subtle at first, like the sound of nails on stone, but the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. The sound was coming from behind the wall, not in front of it. Someone or something was trying to get out. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. There was no logical explanation for it. The house had just been renovated. The walls were solid. No one had ever mentioned anything about strange occurrences in the house. Nothing out of the ordinary, not even a whisper. Yet here I was standing in front of a wall, in a house that I had just moved into, hearing the unmistakable sound of something trapped behind it. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. Was it an animal? A rodent? My mind raced with possibilities. but none of them made sense. That night, I couldn't sleep. I set up my phone, propping it up on the bedside table and facing the wall. If something was happening, I would catch it on camera. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe I could prove I wasn't imagining things. I had to see it for myself. I lay there in the dark, waiting, watching the phone screen as it recorded the empty room. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears as I drifted off, sleep overtaking me despite the gnawing unease in my chest. Morning came too soon. I groggily reached for my phone, stopping just short of my hand reaching the screen. I had never been more afraid to look at something in my life. But I did it. I opened the video. At first, I saw nothing. The room was still. The shadows cast by the dim moonlight seemed to stretch lazily across the floor, unchanged. But then, just before the video cut off, there was shadows, moving. Behind the wall, I watched, my stomach twisting in knots, as the shadows shifted across the pale surface of the wall. They weren't cast by anything I could see. No furniture, no passing headlights, not even the moon. They seemed to be coming from inside the wall itself, crawling, slithering, as though whatever was trying to break free. I felt my breath hitch in my throat as the shadows twitched and swirled. It was as if they were alive, moving of their own accord. They lingered for a long moment before disappearing entirely. I had to be imagining things, right? I looked at the footage again, but the shadows were there. Unmistakable. There was no way I could have edited it that quickly. It was real. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. Who would believe me? But the worst part was that I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there. Trapped behind the walls, waiting. The noise had stopped. The shadows had vanished. But something had been left behind. I had moved in because I thought it was a new start. I thought it would be the fresh chapter one had been longing for, the perfect house in the perfect place. But now, every time I walk into the room, I feel it like eyes are watching me. The air is heavier, thicker. The silence isn't peaceful anymore. It's suffocating. I know it sounds insane, but I swear I hear it sometimes. The tapping, the scratching, faintly. And sometimes, when I'm sitting still in the living room, I think I see something move out of the corner of my eye. It's only a fleeting glimpse, a dark shape shifting against the wall before vanishing. I'm scared to leave, but I'm scared to stay, because I know one thing for sure. Whatever was trapped behind the walls isn't done yet, and it's waiting for me to leave. But I don't think I will, because I'm afraid that if I do, I'll never escape what's waiting inside. Story 2. When Brian and I found the house, we were thrilled. It wasn't a mansion or anything fancy, just a cozy, 2-bedroom cottage nestled on a quiet street. The kind of place you could imagine growing old in, a perfect spot to start our life together. The neighborhood was peaceful, dotted with old trees and modest homes. It felt right. It felt safe. The house had its quirks. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the floors creaked as if they had stories of their own to tell. But there was charm in the imperfections. Brian and I spent weekends painting the walls and rearranging furniture, turning the place into our home. It was all so simple, so perfect. But then things started to change. It began small, so small I almost didn't notice. At night, when the house was still and quiet, I would hear faint footsteps, soft like someone walking across the hardwood floors. Not the kind of creaks the old house made, but distinct, purposeful steps. I'd sit up in bed, straining to listen, my heart pounding in the dark. But each time I checked, the house was empty. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing more than the house settling. Old houses do that, don't they? They creak and groan as if they're alive, adjusting to the weight of the years. Brian thought I was overthinking it. He'd laugh and tell me I was just hearing things. But I wasn't sure. There was something about the sound, something unnerving. It felt deliberate, like someone was pacing the halls, waiting. Days passed, and the footsteps grew louder, more frequent. I started waking up to them every night, just as the clock would strike midnight. The footsteps weren't just random anymore. They had a rhythm, a pattern. Slow, deliberate, almost like someone pacing, thinking. It was maddening. I began to dread the evenings, the moments when the sun dipped below the horizon and the house slipped into silence. One night, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was causing the sounds. I couldn't keep living in a house where I felt like I wasn't alone, where something unseen was always there, walking beside me. So, I took matters into my own hands. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the stairs. The air felt heavier tonight, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The footsteps were quiet now, but I could still hear them faintly. They were coming from the bottom of the stairs, deliberate, slow. I stood there, trembling at the top of the staircase, my heart thudding in my chest. There was no way I was going to let whatever this was continue to haunt me. I waited. The sound grew louder, closer. Step after step, the heavy footfalls moved up the stairs. I could feel it now, the air thick with anticipation, like the house was alive, its old bones creaking under the weight of whatever it was that walked inside it. I shined the flashlight down the stairs, but the beam only cut through the dark for a few feet, leaving the rest of the space bathed in shadow. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath. The air was so thick now that I thought I might suffocate. I waited, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. But nothing moved. The silence in the house was deafening. I peered into the dark, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself. But there was nothing, no one. I ran to the bottom of the stairs, checked every room, flipped on every light. The house was empty, just like it always had been, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still there, lingering in the shadows, watching. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps. I needed to know more, needed some explanation that made sense. So, I went to the neighbors. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I had to ask. I had to know if anyone had lived in the house before us. Surely someone had, right? The house couldn't have been vacant forever. It was Mrs. Delaney next door who told me. She was an older woman, sweet but a little on edge. I could see the worry in her eyes when I asked about the house. "Oh dear," she said, her voice shaking a little. "It's been years since anyone lived there. Before you, the last owner was Miss Evelyn. She was an elderly lady, lived alone for most of her life. I'm afraid she passed away in that house, right in the living room." My stomach dropped. They say she was a bit of a recluse, never left much. But I always thought she was a kind soul," Mrs. Delaney continued. I think, I think she might have passed away quietly in her sleep, but, well, some folks say she never really left. That house is a way of holding on to things. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced. I asked Mrs. Delaney if anyone had noticed anything strange in the house, and she hesitated before answering. They say, they say her presence lingers, she said softly, as if speaking the words aloud might bring something to life. But I wouldn't worry about it, dear. It's just old stories. Nothing to fear, but I couldn't shake it. I went back to the house, my mind buzzing with Mrs. Delaney's words. She never really left. The thought stuck with me, gnawing at me, until I couldn't take it anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me, waiting for something. I decided to sleep on the couch, hoping the noise would stop if I wasn't in the bedroom. Brian was away on business, so I had the whole house to myself. Or so I thought. I lay down on the couch, trying to calm my nerves, but sleep wouldn't come. The house felt different, heavy like it was holding its breath. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, but I felt it in my bones. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened. And then it happened. I felt it. Oh wait, a shift in the air beside me. The cushions sank, as if someone had sat down beside me. I froze, my heart slamming in my chest. I turned slowly, expecting to see Brian, but the space beside me was empty. And then I heard it, breathing, soft, steady, rhythmic breathing, so close I could feel the warmth of it on my skin, but there was no one there. I jerked away, my hands trembling as I grabbed the edge of the couch, my breathing shallow and panicked. The room was silent again. The air felt heavy, like something was waiting, listening. I stayed up the rest of the night, eyes wide open, staring into the dark, but no more footsteps came. No more breaths. Brian returned the next day, and I didn't say a word. What could I say? He'd never believe me. I wasn't sure I believed myself. But every night since, I feel it. The presence beside me, waiting in the dark. It's always there, sitting just out of view, breathing softly in the shadows. And I'm starting to wonder if it was never really a house at all. Maybe it's just a place where things go to wait. And I fear I'm one of them now. Story 3. We had only been in the house for a week when I first noticed it. The cold. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a quirk of the old house. An eccentricity, if you will. The kind of thing you shrug off when you're still caught up in the excitement of moving into a new place. But as the days passed, that coldness began to feel like something more. The room was at the back of the house, the smallest one, tucked away behind the kitchen. I never really paid much attention to it until that first night. I thought it would make a perfect office. Quiet, secluded, and away from the hustle of the rest of the house. So, on a whim, I decided to try it out. I opened the door, and I immediately felt the change. It was as though the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in a heartbeat. A chill that made my skin crawl. The kind of cold that seeps deep into your bones. The kind that no heater seems capable of touching. I shrugged it off, convinced that maybe the heating system had a glitch. Old houses, I thought. Always something to fix. But when I checked the thermostat, it read a steady 72 degrees, just like the rest of the house. No problem there. I went back to work in the living room, trying to ignore the cold sensation that still lingered in the back of my mind. The next day it was still there, cold, even colder than before. I decided to try and figure it out. Maybe the radiator in that room was faulty, so I went in to inspect it. I half expected to find a broken valve or a draft coming through a crack in the window, but there was nothing. The radiator worked just fine, the window was sealed tight, and yet the room was freezing. I even brought out a thermometer to measure the temperature, and sure enough, it read at least 10 degrees lower than the rest of the house. No explanation, nothing that made sense. It didn't sit right with me, but life went on. I told myself it was just an oddity, that I'd figure it out sooner or later. Then came that night. It was late, well past midnight, when I found myself standing in the hallway, staring at that door again. The cold room. The feeling that I had been avoiding for days was now a heavy weight in my chest. It felt wrong, that room. I didn't know how to explain it, but there was a presence there. Something waiting, watching. I hesitated for a moment before I reached for the doorknob. I could almost hear the room calling me. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but there was something about the silence, the oppressive stillness, that felt like a beckoning. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. I've never felt cold like that. It wasn't just a chill. It was like the room itself was alive, breathing in some sort of frozen dead air. My breath fogged up in front of me, and a strange pressure pressed against my chest. It was hard to breathe, like the air itself was too thick to pass through my lungs. I stepped forward, my feet barely making a sound on the carpet, though it felt like I was walking through molasses. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. The air around me seemed heavier, denser. It was suffocating. And then came the sound, a low hum, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder by the second. It was like the walls themselves were vibrating, humming with a noise I couldn't quite place. My heart began to race. I tried to leave, to get out, but the door wouldn't open. My hand fumbled with the doorknob, twisting and turning it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The pressure in the room increased, and I felt the temperature dip even further. It was as if the room was swallowing me whole. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me, thick, white puffs that drifted in the air like ghostly tendrils. I felt like I was freezing from the inside out, as though the cold was crawling under my skin, taking hold of my very soul. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I was trapped. I wanted to scream, but my throat had gone dry. My voice stuck somewhere deep inside of me. My fingers twisted the doorknob again and again, but it wouldn't move. And then, just as I was about to lose my mind, something strange happened. The door swung open. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't slow. It wasn't like I'd managed to turn the knob in time. It was as if the room had decided it was done with me, and the door simply opened on its own, without a sound, without any warning. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, my body shaking as if I had just stepped out of an ice bath. My skin was cold, my body shaking uncontrollably, but the room, that room, was silent again. The temperature in the hallway felt normal, warm even. The rest of the house felt fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something that had been waiting in that room for a very long time. I never went back in. I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to even look at the door without a sense of dread crawling up my spine. The room has never been cold again, not since that night, but I don't trust it. I don't trust the stillness. I don't trust the way the shadows move behind that door when I'm alone in the house. I can't help but feel like something is still there, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. It's funny, I thought I had moved into a new house, but I didn't. I moved into something else, something old, something hungry, and now, every time I walk past that room, I feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. Waiting, watching. I don't go near that room anymore, and I don't plan to. But deep down, I know whatever was in there is still watching me. And it's not done yet.